Welcome and thank you for joining us for the concluding roundtable for the fall 2023 installment of our series on the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in the United States. This is hosted by Princeton University's Keller Center, and it's amazing, so exciting. We started the series in the spring of 2021 and are thrilled to be continuing it. I'm excited to tell you about this series and to reintroduce you to the three scholars from this semester, Doctors Myrick Harris, Moten, and Wadhwani. Dr. Keith Hollingsworth, a prominent Morehouse professor and former visiting professor at Princeton last academic year. He was hosted by the Keller Center, and I will moderate today's roundtable. My name is Ihsan Beezer, and I'm a University Administrative Fellow hosted by the Keller Center and a PhD candidate at Rutgers Business School, where I study entrepreneurship from both contemporary and historical perspectives. The center's mission is to arm our community with intellectual foundation, innovation skills, and networks to propel positive and sustainable societal impact. As a center, we recognize the pervasive and systemic racial inequity in our country and how this is deeply linked to so many of our country's most profound challenges. We understand how important it is that our community has an understanding of these systemic inequities as we work on solving some of humanity's most pressing challenges. Which brings me to this series of lectures. For all interested in innovation and entrepreneurship, a lot can be learned from the entrepreneurs who have succeeded under some of the most daunting constraints. At the end of the day, this is what entrepreneurship is about assembling limited resources, having impact. Black entrepreneurs and innovators have overcome restrictive markets, segregation, Jim Crow laws, lack of access to capital, threats of violence, death, theft of intellectual property, and many other extreme challenges. Still, they thrived. These entrepreneurs have created innovations that have resulted in lasting societal and cultural changes far beyond the Black community. By exploring the history of Black entrepreneurship and innovation, we want to learn the creative strategies Black entrepreneurs employed to succeed. At the same time, we want to explore how the constraints on Black entrepreneurship and business development have limited the overall economics not only of Black communities, but our society as a whole, and how so many of these constraints which have become institutionalized can be overcome in the future. This exciting series of talks brings together scholars and academics from numerous institutions from around the world to share their scholarship in a discussion-based forum. But before today's roundtable, during the roundtable, please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, please. Your questions take priority, so please do not be shy. So, Dr. Myrick Harris, you will first begin by sharing a bit about your background and a reminder of your talk, then Dr. Moten, and then Dr. Wadhwani. You'll provide a similar background information. So thank you, and Dr. Myrick Harris, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ihsan. I am Clarissa Myrick Harris, Professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College. I'm also co-founder of the Morehouse College Black Men's Research Institute and principal investigator for the Morehouse College Mellon Humanities for All Times initiative, Movement, Memory, and Justice. And we focus on creating curriculum, digital products, and exhibitions and publications to educate students and public about the criminal justice system and injustices in that system and ways to transform that system. My research generally focuses on the intersection of race, class, culture, and gender in the quest for social change and social justice, with emphasis on leadership during the civil rights and Black Power movements. My research or my publications include publication chapters in the book called Southern Black Women in the Modern Civil Rights Movement. I talk about the tradition of Black women activism in Georgia specifically. I have a chapter also in the groundbreaking book, Women of the Civil Rights Movement, Trailblazers and Torchbearers. And I am currently working on a book, an edited volume on the history of the Atlanta student movement called Keep Pushing the Atlanta Student Movement from Quest for Human Rights to the Demand for Black Power. I have an article coming up to be published in the Black Scholar in February of 2024. And it's a part of that special issue on the 60th anniversary of Blues People by Leroy Jones. And that title is The Gospel According to Leroy Jones, Gospel Music as a Passing Reference in the Blues People. So as an Africana Studies scholar, I tackle, I look at, I examine a variety of subjects, but it's all connected. My presentation last month was focused on the 3 Black newspapers in Atlanta, Georgia, primarily in the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement, and really on into the Black Power era. Those 3 newspapers were the Atlanta Daily World, which was established in 1928, the Atlanta Inquirer in 1960, and the Atlanta Voice in 1966. The Atlanta Daily World was really, by the 1960s, a conservative publication, although at its birth, it was an advocate and strong voice for Black empowerment politically, socially, economically. In 1960, in response to the conservatism of the Atlanta Daily World, students involved in the Atlanta student movement, students of the Atlanta University Center, Morehouse College, Bellman College, Clark College, Atlanta University, and the Interdenominational Theological Center, partnered with local Black businessmen and women to launch the Atlanta Inquirer, again in 1960. And it had a wide leadership, not only locally in Atlanta, but even nationally. In fact, national media outlets often referred to articles in the Atlanta Inquirer, articles about the movement that were not covered in the mainstream press, the Atlanta Journal, Atlanta Constitution, or even in the Atlanta Daily World. The Atlanta Voice newspaper, the 3rd paper I talked about, was established in 1966 and was conceived to reflect the concerns and actions of Atlanta's diverse Black community as the civil rights movement ebbed and the Black Power movement emerged. All 3 of these publications actually still exist in digital form, as well as limited copies of that publication, issues of those publications rather, in hard copy, but their life really is lived at its fullest in the digital format, and they have readerships in some cases globally. So that's my summary of myself and my talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Myrick Harris. Dr. Moten, please.
Good afternoon. I am so happy to be here at the Roundtable, and it's so interesting and exciting to hear from the other speakers, to get overviews of their talks and understand that many of our questions and concerns are so very related. Thank you, Clarissa, for sharing your work. As I think about my work as a historian, museum curator, and author, I have similar questions and concerns. For my research, my specific research also focuses on women in the civil rights movement, but I focus on women and their struggles for economic justice in the urban Midwest, focusing specifically on the Black Midwestern city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my book just came out this March, and I'm just gonna add it to the chat. It's called Continually Working. And the book explores the ways in which Black working women, and if someone could share that broader with the group, the ways in which Black working women understood the struggle for good jobs during the civil rights era, as well as the actions they took to make that possible for those in their community and around the nation. And so my interest begins with a concern for Black working women and understanding what they were doing to transform their communities in terms of economic justice. As I was doing that research, of course, I began to question and understand the work of Black businesswomen and the work of Black entrepreneurs. And so when thinking about the concerns of Black working women, what we understand is many times when Black working women question and resist the labor market, they then shift to entrepreneurship. They shift to thinking about how we can work for ourselves and how we can make and create economic mobility for our communities. And so it's a very natural way to think about labor, and then transition to business and entrepreneurship. As I have been conducting and researching Black working women in Milwaukee, I've also began working in the museum context. And so for my presentation, I focused on my work at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where I co-curated an exhibit called The Only One in the Room, Women Business Leaders and the Cost of Success. My contribution to that exhibition was helping to lead the intellectual and theoretical framework for understanding what it takes Black business women leaders in their industries to succeed, and the structural barriers that many times prevent them from succeeding. We often use this idea of the glass ceiling to explore the barriers that women face. But what we understand about women of color is that many times they can't even get into the door to see the ceiling. And so then what are the characteristics that shape their inability to both progress in industry, and then also the structural barriers that prevent the success of their businesses and entrepreneurial endeavors. However, as I think about the museum industry, and in particular public history, what I noted in my presentation is that we often focus on the exceptional. We focus on the people and the businesses who were able to prevail against these unequal structures. And this was no different in terms of this exhibition. And it's a critique I have, actually. But in terms of this exhibition, we did focus on 8 business women who succeeded. And I spoke about 3 of them that I had the opportunity to research and explore material culture around. One was Magdalena Walker, the prominent Black business community woman and bank owner in Richmond, Virginia. The other was Lena Richard, Black food entrepreneur who got her start in New Orleans, but became a nationally known chef and entrepreneur as she was on her own television cooking show, and as she also first self-published her own cookbook and then also had it published by Houghton Mifflin. I ended my presentation by thinking about the interconnections between women of color in terms of the beauty industry. And I focused on the creator of the now ubiquitous beauty blender, Rianne Silva, who got her start in high definition television, working with women of color such as Regina King, actresses, and on the sets of hip hop videos. And so in her creation of the beauty blender, she really was kind of thinking about the face as a canvas, and particularly the faces of Black women to help them look their best in high definition television. And so as I thought about the ways in which women encounter structural barriers in their work, it was also an opportunity to celebrate those women who not only found success, but who also paved the way for others to come after them. And we see that very much in the example of Magdalena Walker, Lena Richard, and Rianne Silva. And so that was what my presentation was. And as I think about my work currently, again, in the museum, it really is focused on material culture. And so there is much that we can learn by focusing on textual archival sources, but there also is much that we can learn when we look at objects and think about material culture. And so I look forward to questions and conversations around that topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moten. And Dr. Wadhwani, again, similar background about yourself and your talk, please.
Fantastic. And wow, I'm a little intimidated to be following 2 really fantastic presentations, and really kind of excited to have the conversation and learn from both of you guys, Clarissa and Crystal, because I think there might be some interesting intersections with what the project I'm working on is all about. So I'm Dan Wadhwani. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship and history at University of Southern California. And my research broadly deals with the intersection of entrepreneurship and society, both kind of how society, social values, social policies shape entrepreneurship, who gets to be an entrepreneur, who doesn't, sort of the rewards to entrepreneurship, as well as how entrepreneurship reshapes society and the opportunities people have and so forth. So that's kind of broadly conceived. And the particular presentation that I gave last week in my case was about kind of the role of the civil rights movement and the origins of modern entrepreneurial culture. And by that, what I mean is sort of mainstream American entrepreneurial culture, in some ways since about the 1970s, 1980s, has sort of flourished, right? If you think about kind of the language we use when we talk about not just business, but about, the social parts of life or public parts of life. We have, we constantly talk about the language of entrepreneurship, both in business, but then also social entrepreneurship or cultural entrepreneurship or policy entrepreneurship, right? This idea of entrepreneurship has sort of become part of our culture. Similarly, kind of the policies we have and how kind of government policies support particular parts of the economy. The emphasis on entrepreneurial policy has really increased over the last 4 or 5 decades. When scholars ask sort of why and how this happened, obviously they recognize a longer tradition of entrepreneurship in the United States and in US history, but they really emphasize first and foremost kind of a rightward shift in politics starting especially in the 1980s, right? This idea of a neoliberal turn that emphasized market-based values in all aspects of sort of social life, and that emphasized market-based policies. And certainly, I think that is part of the story. But I think what often gets missed or underplayed is sort of in many ways, the earlier origins of a turn towards entrepreneurship, culture, and value, in which I believe that the civil rights movement played a pivotal role in shaping not just the direction of civil rights and other liberationist movements, but of American culture more broadly. And the case study I used to kind of explore this is, so I grew up in Rochester, New York, upstate New York, and during the 1960s, there was sort of the dynamics of the civil rights movement sort of unfurled with a new organization that was established, a more radical organization in some ways called FIGHT. There had been other sort of organizations before it, but FIGHT, which stood for Freedom, Integration, God, Honor Today, was organized by, led by a set of Black churches that organized a shift in some ways in the agenda of civil rights within the city from one that had been focused to some extent on political rights and the franchise to economic rights, and particularly initially around sort of questions of good jobs. In this way, I think, things that Crystal were mentioning really resonates for me about sort of, FIGHT's real focus was to challenge the dominant employer in the city, Kodak, to open up opportunities for African-American workers who had kind of migrated to the city over the previous decade and a half, but were in many ways excluded from many of the job opportunities in the city by just the kind of structural racism in the job market and the structural inequalities in the job market. And that battle between FIGHT and Kodak played out in the city in a way that really got a lot of attention, that sort of where FIGHT challenged Kodak even within its shareholder meetings and created both kind of a lot of new attention and some animosity, right, in terms of sort of the direction of the movement. And following that, sort of you saw several different directions within the civil rights movement, both within the liberal and more radically reconstructivist sort of movement. And one of that was a shift, I would argue, from a focus on jobs to a focus on empowerment through entrepreneurship, very much kind of, I think, in line with some of the things that was mentioned before, including the sort of, and I love the name, a company that was called Fight On Inc., which was about it was owned by the civil rights organization FIGHT, so Fight On Inc., with the idea that it represented community interests rather than individual shareholders, and that eventually employees would own the business. And Fight On Inc. sort of was very kind of, in some ways, visionary about, saying we're not just looking for sort of limited entrepreneurial sort of opportunities, but like what could we be doing with high-tech organizations like Xerox and sort of really doing some sort of cutting-edge, high-quality employment and opportunities, right? And so they managed in many ways to forge quite a successful organization, right? So Vidon Inc. By the 1970s had grown and eventually grew to sort of employ 350 workers. That had changed its name at some point. But over that course, that process, it also changed some of its organizational structure. So a prominent African-American businessman from Harvard Business School at some point came in and took over and led the organization very successfully as a business, but also started to move it a little bit away from kind of the notion of community ownership to more of a kind of a more traditional individual ownership model and so forth, but had a really important impact, I feel, on also some of the former employees who ended up sort of going on to, found their own firms, be engaged in entrepreneurship, and in some ways sort of served as a model for, other kinds of movements to come as to using entrepreneurship to empower people in their ends. And so the bottom line is, I think, we don't sufficiently recognize the way in which the civil rights movement had this much broader impact on entrepreneurial culture in modern America.
Love it. See how we're so excited? We couldn't find a better set of interrelated topics with these scholars. So thank you so much. That was wonderful, wonderful reminders of your talks and reintroductions of yourselves. So let's get going. This is great. Not every day we get three scholars like you in the room.
You always helped me with so many questions, and I'm trying to think my way through it. And again, we want to encourage you to ask each other questions, but several things come to mind. I'm thinking about, first of all, just how I guess your understanding, what we're trying to do at Princeton and at Morehouse and others, is how do we pull this history into our classrooms? And how do we build the case that knowing this is important? I mean, part of Princeton doing this is saying you can't really look at innovation and entrepreneurship without recognizing some of this history and knowing where it came from. I think it also helps. To me, teaching this course helps not particularly my students, but others to understand systemic racism, because you do see the barriers and you can see that it's not often individual acts of racism, it's structures that have been set up that harm this. But sort of what's your thoughts on how we pull this into our classrooms and the value of needing to know this history?
Good question, Keith. I teach Africana Studies, which is really multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary. And so telling the story is extremely important. And sometimes it becomes difficult to focus on entrepreneurship in the history as we look at, because in many of our courses, most of our courses, especially introductory courses, which are survey courses, you have so much to pack in telling the stories of the experiences of African Americans in this country. But I, a while back, came up with this concept, this idea of a pyramid of power, pyramid of Black empowerment, and looking at that pyramid at the base, really, and we're talking about after the end of the Civil War, going into Reconstruction, and certainly on into the Jim Crow era, where you have an institution, first and foremost, Black folks were trying to essentially establish themselves, reunite their families, establish a sense of community. And to begin with, a part of that process of establishing community was establishing the Black church. Some had existed in the South before or in the midst of the antebellum era, and others were created early in Reconstruction and so on. But that became a basis for not only worship, but also the creation of incubator for birthing mechanism for businesses, for social institutions, for the galvanizing of political power. And so when we look at the history of Black entrepreneurship, we really do have to look at it holistically in terms of how that worked with other institutions, systems within the Black community to ultimately empower Black people. And really, we know that Black entrepreneurship was first and foremost the first road to portal into economic empowerment, because there were no jobs, right? Unless you were going to be a sharecropper or you domestic service, really the same kinds of jobs that we did in enslavement. And so entrepreneurship became that gateway to autonomy and empowerment, and for some building wealth, and for some just sustaining themselves. And again, so you have that first level of the Black church, then you have Black educational institutions that came out of that. And then from those educational institutions in the Black church, you have these businesses that were incubated, mutual aid societies were established within that context. They later became insurance companies. And Crystal, I'm sure you talked about that in your exhibition. And those businesses then worked with the church and with the educational institutions to become supporters and incubators for leadership in terms of social institutions, in terms of political power in the community. And so that apex of this pyramid is the confluence of all these areas that ultimately resulted historically in the empowerment of the Black community. And so I think placing our history within that context, you see the importance of entrepreneurship, supporting the movement on every level. I talked about the Atlanta Inquirer really being supported by Black businesses, and you see other aspects of the civil rights movement in particular being supported by independent Black business folk. So that's important to keep in mind. And I'll pause there so my colleagues can comment.
There's very few Black businessmen or women who weren't also extremely involved in the community. They always had this, we talk now, sometimes you hear people talk about a triple bottom line. So it's not just profit. But Black businesses have always had that pressure. So again, I can name one or two exceptions, but in general, most Black businessmen and women were also extremely involved in the community and saw their businesses as a way to uplift the community, not just themselves.
Right.
And so you do see that. And Dan, in the paper I wrote on legitimacy, which you brought up, I brought up the case that the Black church granted legitimacy because it was the strongest force often in the Black community was the Black church. And so therefore, it itself granted legitimacy to these Black businesses. But anyway, y'all follow up with your thoughts on this, Crystal and Dan.
Yeah,
Crystal,
thanks. No, yeah, thank you. I come at this question in terms of how do we speak about the import and significance of these histories, particularly in classrooms. And as you know, my understanding of classroom is very vast. But in my former work as a history professor and as a professor who also had to teach survey classes, particularly U.S. history and African American history survey, what I found myself trying to do was even in the African American history curriculum, there still is this focus on kind of a main narrative, the main narrative by which we want to see and analyze the African American, the Black past. And so on the one hand, we know there's a dearth of understanding around Black history and the Black past. And so we want to give people or students the basic understanding, right? But we also know we have to trouble that understanding. And so as I kind of crafted my classes, I was always caught between exploring with students, these are the basics you need to know, but here is how we can question, right, how we've come to understand these as the basics. And part of that was always asking students, especially when we got to certain kind of main topics: enslavement period, Reconstruction, World War II, civil rights, women's movement, Black power. It's understanding and thinking about what were the ways in which folks were understanding their own activism, right? And so when we think about and we expand the questions, I think we're able to show students the significance of understanding the multiplicity of narratives, even in our responsibility to explore the basics. Now, when I think about, and that's just an aside because I'm no longer a professor, but when I think about my work as a historian, particularly in an anti-intellectual context where there is a sustained attack on the humanities, what I come to understand is that the activists who I study now think about a usable past, a usable history. And the only way that they can understand a usable past and a usable history is access to primary sources and access to the stories that not only scholars in the academy are producing, but community historians, community intellectuals are also producing. And so the example that I have is thinking about the work of a group of Bronzeville artist entrepreneurs, Bronzeville in Milwaukee, which was named after the Bronzeville in Chicago because of the growing prolific Black community developed in Milwaukee as a result of the late Great Migration. We have this group of women who consider themselves, quote unquote, the Bronzeville babes. And what that is in hearkening back to the heyday of the Milwaukee Black community, where in Bronzeville there was a thriving business and commercial district that saw both male and female entrepreneurs really carving out economic mobility for Black folks during that era. And so what I see now is Black activist entrepreneurs looking to the past for examples of both success and struggle to help inform what they are doing today. And so it really is making sure that the work we are doing in our respective arenas is reaching a broad of audience as it can, that is not being circumscribed to the ivory tower, and that we are making sure that we are in conversation with the broader public, who can then employ and deploy the lessons that we are finding in our sources to broader audiences and make it usable for today.
Yes. Excellent.
Go ahead, Clarissa, and then I'll
No, Dan, I just said that's excellent. I agree.
Yeah, no, it is excellent. So I've got one kind of, I think, pretty straightforward idea, Keith, to respond to your question, and then one where I'm going to kind of riff a little bit off of what Crystal's saying, because I thought that was a really interesting kind of angle to take. So, I teach in a business school, and I teach sort of as much as I can sometimes in history, but like much of what I'm teaching is, case method. And this is in some ways, some aspect of, if we have an attack on the humanities, where are some of those students going? Many of them are going into business schools, right? And why are they going into business schools? Because, it's a very reasonable response from the students themselves. They want to be economically secure in a sort of increasingly insecure kind of world for them, right? And I think that does mean, in some ways there's a risk of loss of what the humanities can provide. But I think that just like we have forms of public history that Crystal was talking about, part of this is how can we go to where the learners are and the students are, and there, within the business school, the case study, the teaching case study is the kind of, coin of the realm, right? And to me, that seems like something very tangible that the Keller Center could do to really kind of cultivate, maybe get out some teaching cases that could, teach aspects of business and of history, right? I think there is that ability to do both. And so I think that kind of thing is something that I think many schools would look for as a way of kind of slotting those kinds of cases into a curriculum that tends to be, let's be honest, sort of overwhelmingly these overachieving Harvard Business School kind of things, right? So the you know what we represent in our teaching through our case studies is a really skewed view of the world sometimes in business schools, right? And kind of you know, doing case studies that you know that are historical, that represent sort of, you know, African American entrepreneurs really in situations that were tough situations. I think that would really be a welcome opportunity. You know, along those same lines, you know, in terms of what, you know, Crystal's idea of a public history. I mean, in some ways, you know, a lot of companies have started to realize the value of their history and of their brands, right? And in some ways, you could say that there's a real value to African American entrepreneurship history that remains in some ways to be tapped, right? Are there ways to not just tell these stories, but make them valuable as brands, as sort of identities that people can, you know, use and aspire to, as ways of kind of being entrepreneurial themselves, right? It's sort of as a way of enacting that. And the last thing is sort of, Clarissa, I love this idea of the church's incubator. I mean, you know, I think that it is true, right? I mean, you get these accelerators, incubators today, but, you know, I would love to see something written on that. I think it's a fascinating idea.
Sure, that's coming.
Good. That's great. Let us know when it's
Crystal,
out.
yeah, I will. First, I want to follow up on what you were saying. So excited about what you were saying because I am a public historian as well, working actually here in Atlanta with the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And we just did a trip just last week to Montgomery to visit the Equal Justice Initiative museums. Oh my gosh, it was my second time there. But in addition to that, we visited also the Southern Poverty Law Center's museums. Montgomery is an awesome city. I mean, they have 5, and we'll have a 6th museum dedicated to Black history. You know, we're struggling in Atlanta to have at least a couple, but they're realizing the importance of that on so many different levels. When you think Equal Justice Initiative, Southern Poverty Law Center, what do they have in mind? They're about criminal justice, right? And the understanding that there has to be this knowledge of what actually transpired all throughout history, not only as they prepare their briefs for their cases, but that knowledge has to be shared to a wider audience. And so what they shared at EJI, for instance, was that they've done all this research to build these museums, the Legacy Museum, the Lynching Memorial. And so when they have a case, you know, they refer to the research has already been done. And so in a similar vein, how do you then, with these public history projects, the real time, real life, real world exhibitions, as well as digital exhibitions, how do you utilize those tools to prepare people for, our young people in particular, for lives of entrepreneurship? We are at a pivotal moment, Dan, as you mentioned, in terms of young people going out and say, you know, where are the jobs? How do I get into this? Well, entrepreneurship is, as you also said, it is really, really booming now, Black entrepreneurship on so many different levels. But looking back at that history, at our history in terms of entrepreneurship, and looking at the history, again, Crystal, you mentioned Bronzeville. In Atlanta, we had Auburn Avenue, the once called the richest Negro street in the world by Fortune magazine in 1955. You had Wilmington. You had, of course, Black Wall Street. I visited Tulsa just in September. And, you know, you look at what's there now, and it's the same for all of these once thriving Black business districts. It's really sad, but you know, we also have to understand, interestingly enough, this interplay and understanding that the successes of the civil rights movement, integration, also contributed to the downfall of these thriving Black communities. So how do you counter that? You know, the realization. So you have, you know, FIGHT, and then you have Rainbow Push Coalition, and you have these various entities that say, okay, well, we're going to really, really fight to have more opportunities within existing business and corporations. But what also, my question is, what also can be done to encourage more entrepreneurship within the Black community and rebuild those constituencies, those customers, those clients that during the 70s and 80s often went elsewhere. It's happening now. I'm seeing it, and much of it's happening virtually on digital platforms. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts, Crystal, Dan, on this resurgence, more Dan from you on this resurgence of Black entrepreneurship and more about how we plug them into this past to learn those lessons.
Well, I really, it's a great challenge. I honestly threw it out there as, a crazy idea riffing off of Crystal, but I think there's something there, right? I wonder, there are companies that have been very successful in using their own identity or other identities, historical identities, and rebuilding, whether or not it's sort of a product that's named after a historical founder or a historical product, where you're using that storytelling as part of the venture itself, right? And so this sort of usable past is something that in business education is something that's gaining more and more interest, right? Because you can kind of think a little bit about, well, if you build a new brand or a new identity from scratch, that's really hard, right? To be kind of out there to build something where people feel authentic about it, right? And that's where I think that people are increasingly, entrepreneurs and others more generally, turning to the past to kind of draw on, kind of this the sense of authenticity, but also the stories that are there, the value of all of that, to be able to then sort of put that into some aspect of their business plan. Now, I think part of what that requires is sort of not just guidance, and this is where, in part, some of this question about, well, how do you support and incubate some of these businesses come in, right? I think you need, if you're incubating, because entrepreneurship is partly about the economic piece of it, but there is partly the empowerment piece of it too, right? You need kind of accelerators, incubators that support this sort of direction, that support that idea of leveraging kind of the uniqueness of the stories of African American entrepreneurs. And I think that might be a viable thing, right? Sort of, because there are kind of so many of these incubators, accelerators out there. What if there could be something that took, some of the great sort of translations into public history, but then also took that from public history into the practice of, okay, how do we build something new out of that old, right? And I think that would be really fascinating.
Yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
that is super exciting. And I think what comes to mind as I think about how do we create possibilities for entrepreneurship among or encourage possibilities, and where my mind goes is not only to kind of incubators and accelerators, but also the understanding that in the venture capital world, the ways in which Black businesses and particularly Black women-owned businesses are unsupported in that arena. But what we know is that those Black women-owned businesses are among the fastest growing in this country, but they're also among the most unsupported. And so, it's not only kind of thinking about so it's thinking about kind of the structural constraints that that limit access to capital, right? Because in order to make money, you have to have money, right? And so there's this dearth of information, this lack of knowledge about the past, but also this continued structural imbalance as we get into capital. And so thinking about ways in which we can open up opportunities for capital and educate the folks who, typically are white male who are running these venture capitalist firms. And I know, just from kind of my own, personal and professional connections, there are more Black-owned venture capitalist firms opening, but they're in the minority. Right. And so it's thinking about the structure of capital and the ways in which we can transform that to help create more possibilities.
Well, I want to mention two things. One, at Morehouse now, our entrepreneurship centers worked with JP Morgan Chase in a group called Ascend 2020, in which they're trying to help minority businesses succeed, move a little bit further. There's 4 colleges that are partners with it. I know Kellogg is one. I know the University of Washington is one, but Morehouse is one. And the approach we've taken, our distinctive approach, is that if you're going to do this, if you're going to talk about helping minority business people succeed, you first need to help them see themselves in this time. And so we actually started the presentation in September, and I was the keynote speaker. And they brought me in, and we did this first case of, hey, look at where you are. Look at some of the barriers that have been around forever. Again, look at some of the systemic part. And you're hoping not just the entrepreneurs are hearing this, but the sponsors around it are listening to this to understand that. And so that is the sort of tack we're taking, is that in order to help minority entrepreneurs grow, help them see themselves as part of this timeline. Help them see themselves as part of a narrative. Help them see themselves as some of their struggles are not new. This is what other people have done. And again, you want to talk to IBM and others and say, hey, JP Morgan Chase, do you see this structure? And we'll say one last thing, I'll throw this out to you, because it goes back to what Dan was saying. Mercer Baradaran, in her book, The Color of Money, which if you haven't read, you should, is about the history of Black banking. But she makes the case in the 70s that the politicians seized the language of Black entrepreneurship and Black capitalism as a way of not changing the structural things that needed to be changed, but more of the, hey, let's help everybody help themselves, pull them up some by their bootstraps, and threw money into programs that were sort of to help Black entrepreneurs, but then you're not changing the structures that have really been in place for years. And I think that's I bring it up in my class all the time, that it's sort of this, they speak the language of entrepreneurship, but they're not really changing. They're still sitting there shaking her head. So she wants to jump on. But go ahead and talk about that for a moment. So we don't want the language of entrepreneurship, which is great, to take away from the fact that there's some structures that still need to be changed.
Yes. Well, I colleagues, I just want to throw this out there. I'm a new board member of Atlanta Museum, the Apex Museum. The Apex Museum has been around for 45 years, and it has it survived because of the tenacity of one man, Dan Moore Sr. The Apex has been struggling to build phase 2, a state-of-the-art museum to tell these stories. I did the Apex's first exhibition on the history of Sweet Auburn Avenue decades ago. I won't tell you how many decades ago, but it's a long time ago, long time ago. Okay, that story needs to be known widely. People know vaguely about that history of Sweet Auburn, the history of Black Wall Street, the history of Wilmington, Bronzeville, whatever, but specifics they don't know. They don't know these details of how these Black people, Black women, Black men were able to be successful in spite of all of the obstacles in their way. What we see now occurring in Atlanta and in Tulsa and other places is a revitalization of these areas, but often those who are doing the revitalization are not members of the Black community. They're business folk who come in, they see the potential, and they set up shop, they create, they renovate buildings, they start businesses, but they're not really invested in the rebuilding of the Black community. They aren't hooked into the community in ways that would empower others, and then they're not into that dynamic that was established long ago, where Black businesses were not only successful in their own right, but they set about making sure that there were opportunities and economic advancement in the community more broadly. And in some cases, some of these modern entrepreneurs who have gentrified areas, they have a facade or pretense of that, but it's not very deep. And I think this is replicated all over, symbolic gestures to the history. But the bulk of the wealth goes back to them, not into the community. And so I would like the Apex Museum to be a case study for how to overcome that and empower the Black community through the telling of our stories about the successes, the struggles, successes, the lessons of Black entrepreneurs of the past. I'm throwing that out there.
Thank you so much. And we have about 6 minutes left, so we want to make sure that the scholars can ask more questions amongst each other. So don't be shy as our time approaches.
Well, maybe a question for Clarissa, if it's okay. I mean, I think we've talked about sort of the importance of public history, but what your story really highlights for me is also of public journalism, and journalism that's sort of, Black journalism, because I mean, I just think about some of the kind of stories that I'm trying to ferret out about what was going on at Fight On, and they just don't get covered right in the mainstream press. In part because I think it was sort of a tense and fractious moment, right? And so even though this is, in some ways, you would think these are big deals and big relationships between Fight On and Xerox. So I guess more a kind of more general question or a comment about the lessons of that for kind of how we cover and report on these issues today, and what we can kind of learn from those kinds of sort of episodes and so forth.
Yes.
I don't know if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there's so many ways in so many media outlets now. I was talking earlier about, in my presentation, I talked about the fact that those 3 newspapers, the Atlanta Daily World, the Atlanta Inquirer, and the Atlanta Voice, still exist in the virtual realm. And so I think having those connections and utilizing those connections to do the things that we're talking about makes sense. I wanted to hear from Crystal some more about about all of this.
Yeah, the importance of the Black press, and I would actually extend that to Black intellectuals and knowledge producers, and understanding and analyzing their own histories and activism cannot be understated, especially when you think about the ways in which, Black knowledge and knowledge production has been, silenced, ignored, erased, not only in kind of ways that the public can access, but then, again, I go back to thinking about the historical record in the archive. And so you really have to think carefully and creatively around how to find and understand these stories. And many times in my experience, my research experience, I found these stories in the most mundane of sources. And so not only thinking about the Black press, but thinking about the meeting minute or the church newsletter, the church program, right? Because oftentimes you can get a fuller accounting of what's going on in these communities when you kind of go to the sources, go to the publications that they are creating and circulating among themselves. And so, yes, for the importance of kind of the publicly available aspects of Black journalism and Black writing, but also kind of thinking about those internal and informal ways of producing and disseminating information and knowledge.
For sure. And that's where museums and digital platforms really are going to, now more than ever, play a really important part, now that we are in this phase in which history is being erased, or an attempt to erase Black history. And that's legal across the country, and so how do we counteract that to make sure if they don't get it in the schools, they get it someplace? And so these institutions of history museums or centers, and the digital platforms are really, really, we have to be very intentional about making sure this
And the
history.
things like,
Yeah.
and the things like High on the Hog, which I think was an excellent
Yes.
documentary that came out. I haven't seen the second
Fantastic.
one yet. I
Oh,
haven't
it's
seen the
fantastic.
first one. But I want
And
to pull
I'll
up
put a
something
plug
just
in
for
for
Oh, that's right. Y'all get right. The High on the Hog one deals with Atlanta this time. The second one does.
yes,
It
the
does.
third,
It has.
you know, it was the third episode. I consulted on
Yes.
that one, and
Oh,
our director of public history, I was not able to be on it, but I actually referred them to our director of the public history program,
oh,
Dr.
excellent.
Karchit Sims Alvarado, who was the
That's
scholar in
right.
the room, along with three of the activists in the Atlanta student movement, which is
Because it was a lot around the restaurant. I do want to throw one thing out before we close, because we do have a attendee today. It goes back to what Crystal says, but people building their own history. Because there's a woman here who has written her own book she's done the research herself after she retired and written a book about a Black businessman. And so anyway, her question is, what if you have a story of a Black business? What should be done with it so it can be made available and used in the ways that are mentioned here? So again, she's done a lot of research. I have a copy of it. I confess I have not had a chance to read it yet, but I'm going to make my students look at it next semester. But so what do you have when you have somebody, Crystal, who, now you're talking about a local person who has done the work herself. How do we get this history out?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And one of the first ways I'll respond is thinking about the local institutions that are in the community, right? And so there are local history institutions, local organizations, local churches, that community building. And that's what we understand when we do the work of public history, that is collaborative, and that you're often engaging and bringing together multiple communities. And so my first kind of response is, who are you and who is this wonderful author in conversation in within their own community? I also think very specifically about the public school system and the way in which this author might be able to work with public school teachers based on kind of the stories that the person is telling, to share that work with students in the public school system in the community in which they are from. I think many times people, they research their own stories, they write their books, and they often want to go and say, I want to put it in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I want it in Washington, D.C. When really where it could have the best seed and opportunity for growing is out of that local context. And so that would be my initial response. What are the local ways in which this author can get this word out, and then build and let it grow upward from there?
Yes.
It's been wonderful, but I'm going to pass it over to Ihsan.
Do we have, I think we have one more minute. Do you have any other thing that's you've been burning to get out? No, from the scholars?
How do we get started on some of these things? Is my question.
Well, I'm going to be in touch with each of you because I think there's some things that we can do together to ensure that this history is known for the general public, and to work with Keith in terms of closer partnerships with these business schools and business departments and entrepreneurship center. So I'm fired up. I'm ready to work with each of you to make sure that history is known.
Good, perfect. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's a big part of this series, is forming a community and getting actual work and high quality scholarship done and impactful work. So thank you. All right, so I mean, wow, what an insightful and lively roundtable. We truly appreciate everyone for joining us, for your insightful and timely questions, scholars and audience alike. Thank you, Doctors Myrick Harris, Moten, and Wadhwani, for sharing your expertise, passion, and time. You are now a part of the Keller Center family forever. So special thanks to the Keller Center and Princeton University for enthusiastically supporting and hosting this lecture series on the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in the United States. As a reminder, this series happens every semester, so we'll return in spring 2024 with another amazing cohort of scholars. And again, thank you everyone, and We have the recordings for all the lectures existing, also forthcoming from this semester, and the roundtables on the Keller Center site. So please show the love and watch, share, comment. Keep this conversation alive beyond, like Dr. Myrick Harris mentioned. Let's collaborate, keep in touch. This is a really big part of what's going on, not just sharing the knowledge, but continuing to grow it and to keep in touch with each other. Okay. So thank you everyone in the audience. You guys are amazing. You're never shy, which is wonderful. And we'll see you in the spring.